Readers interested in Western European literature of the 19th century have perhaps, like me, come across the curious and mostly obscure movement of decadent literature. The term decadence entered common English usage in the 18th century, as the word was applied to the deterioration of a society or civilization. Decadence in the 19th century signified the deviance of individuals or subsets of a society. In the late 19th century, the decadent movement firstly emerged in France and operated as a reactionary movement against the prevailing cultural norms and artistic conventions of the time. The loose grouping of decadents wished to challenge traditional values and aesthetics through their writing whilst exploring artifice, excess, and a profound sense of world-weariness. In France, decadence as a term was adopted by fiction writer Théophile Gautier and poet Charles Baudelaire, who used the word to represent a rejection of what they considered banal progress. In fact, Baudelaire referred to himself as decadent in his 1857 edition of his poetry book, Les Fleurs du Mal. Baudelaire was inspired by the decline of the Roman Empire, seeing it as an inspiration to express passion. In 1868, Gautier writes an introduction to Baudelaire's Fleurs du Mal, in which he concurs with Baudelaire's opinions that decadence is a preference for what is beautiful and what is exotic, an ease with surrendering to fantasy, and a maturity of skill with manipulating language. The movement remained loosely defined until Maurice Barré in 1884 makes an attempt to characterize the group of writers he terms as decadents, defining the group as writers who have been influenced heavily by Baudelaire, Gothic novels, and the poetry and fiction of Edgar Allan Poe. This influence is clear in the short fiction works of Théophile Gautier. The Adolescent, or in French La Cafetière, tells the tale of a young man who, while staying in the house of his uncle, becomes enchanted with a lady depicted in a tapestry hanging in his room. He is more than a little astonished when his attentions are returned and the woman pays a nocturnal visit to him. Also, Gautier's 1856 novella Jettatura tells of Paul d'Aspremont, who travels to Naples to join Alicia, his fiancée. Eventually, Alicia grows pale under his gaze. As an Italian suitor, Count Altavilla is simultaneously trying to win her affections. Soon the local superstitions convince Paul that he has the evil eye and that he must resort to extreme measures to save Alicia. Also in France in the 1870s and 1880s, writers like Joris Karl Huysmans and Paul Verlaine began to explore decadent themes of sensuality, morbidity, and the supernatural. Huysmans' 1884 novel À rebours, or in English, Against Nature, went on to become the unofficial quintessential example of a decadent novel. In the novel, the central narrative revolves around Jean des Esseintes, who, despite being an eccentric aesthete, is reclusive and unwell. Des Esseintes, being the last of an aristocratic family, loathes bourgeois society and retreats into his own ideal world. The narrative functions to catalogue Des Esseintes' aesthetic tastes, musing on literature, painting, religion, and his sensory experiences. The decadent movement emerged out of the fin-de-siècle literary tradition, which was characterized by a sense of impending collapse and renewal. The loose term for decadent literature is thus applied to works interested in new forms of artistic expression in the face of a perceived decline and degeneration of society. Decadents were fascinated with decay, mortality, and beauty, usually of an artificial kind, and reflected these themes through highly stylized descriptions and imagery. Decadent works rejected the realism and naturalism which made up the literary conventions of the late 19th century, and in turn explored the fantastical and the artificial. According to Arthur Symons, the British poet, critic, and translator, who was a contributor to the decadent movement, explains that the pursuit of the decadent writers was a desperate endeavor to flash the imperfection of the moment, to preserve the very heat and motion of life. Indeed, the decadent movement spread from France to other countries, Charles Baudelaire's writing being accredited with inspiring the British decadent movement. Perhaps the most clear example of British decadent literature is Oscar Wilde's 1890 novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray. The novel's main character, Dorian Gray, is a selfish young man who becomes captivated by the beliefs of Lord Henry, a decadent dandy and hedonist. After he gets his portrait painted, Dorian wishes the likeness of him on canvas would age instead of his own real flesh. The novel is an exploration of the moral decay caused by the pursuit of pleasure and indulgent lifestyles. As for Arthur Symons, the poet's early work, such as Days and Nights from 1889, focuses on capturing urban life's mysticism and eroticism. Symons also wrote autobiographical fiction, such as Spirited Adventures and A Prelude to Life, which illustrates his destitute and aimless mentality, adhering to a decadent representation of the wandering vagabond. Symons was critiqued by his contemporaries. His work was considered altogether too morbid and perverse. Symons contributed poems and essays to the Yellow Book, a British quarterly literary periodical that was published in London from 1894 to 1897, a periodical that was associated with aestheticism and decadence. Aubrey Beardsley, the first art editor of the periodical, made illustrations which were the most controversial aspect of the periodical, as his work diverged from the Victorian artistic ideal. Beardsley had a style that was considered unnatural and grotesque, and added to the Yellow Book having been considered as scandalous. Despite the color of the periodical referencing French attitudes of the Yellow 90s and the wicked and decadent French novels, the periodical was not as daring as advertised, having been influenced by its publisher, John Lane, who wished the periodical to only be loosely associated with the shocking qualities of the decadent movement. Still, the Yellow Book was associated with Impressionism, Feminism, Naturalism, Dandyism, and Symbolism. Fine examples are John Buchan's At the Article of Death and Rudolph Dirks's Celeste, as well as countless stories by women writers like Marion Hepworth Dixon's A Thief in the Night, Ella Darcy's Irremediable, and Netta Surrett's Thy Heart's Desire. At the time, many male-authored decadent texts constructed an image of woman as a kind of passive femme fatale, which was exemplified in the works of Huysmans, Georges du Maurier, and Leopold von Sacher-Masoch, as female critics argued that in these male-authored decadent texts, female characters embodied a natural and excessive emotionality. Georges du Maurier's 1894 novel, Trilby, is set in the 1850s in an idyllic Bohemian Paris, and is centered around two English artists and a Scottish artist who meet musician Svengali and Trilby O'Farrell, a model and laundress whom all the men in the novel become in love with. As the Englishman and Trilby become friends, the relationship between Trilby and Svengali becomes a central portion of the novel. Trilby eventually suffers from Svengali's forcefulness to train her voice, as he hypnotizes her, transforming her into a talented singer. Du Maurier's novel illustrates the decadent male vision of women and its destructive nature as the men drain Trilby for their art. Nonetheless, decadent fiction saw the emergence of the decadent dandy archetype as well as the new woman archetype. An example of new woman fiction is Mona Caird's 1894 The Daughters of Danaus, whose heroine acts in rebellion against the authority and institutions which she disapproves of. Madame Sarah Grant's novel, from 1893, The Heavenly Twins, becomes one of the most widely read of the New Woman novels and explores non-conventional themes. The novel, aimed at women, addresses issues like syphilis, gender norms, women's education, and other taboo subjects for women. Dissatisfied with her life, the character of Angelica begins dressing as a man and uses her new identity to expand her social and romantic opportunities. The novel's title references Angelica and her twin brother Theodore, or Diavolo, who helps his sister experience the freedoms afforded to young men at the time. New woman literature that appeared out of the decadent tradition was criticized by late Victorians as a threat to the vital bonds of state and culture. The New Woman genre is so multifaceted that I just might have to make a whole other video to do a comprehensive study on the genre. Another interesting subgenre of the period is decadent historicism, with works from authors such as Théophile Gautier, Oscar Wilde, and Vernon Lee. Gautier's early historical fiction novel, Mademoiselle de Maupin, from 1835, loosely relates to the real life of French opera star Mademoiselle Maupin, who was a swordswoman and often went about disguised as a man. Gautier's plot includes a simple love triangle between a man, d'Albert, and his mistress Rosette, who both fall in love with Mademoiselle de Maupin, who was disguised as a man named Theodore. The beginnings of French decadence appear through this tale as Gautier emphasizes the fundamental pessimism of the human identity. Another example is Oscar Wilde's play Salome, originally written in French and later translated to English. The play is the biblical story in which Salome, the stepdaughter of Herod Antipas, demands the head of John the Baptist on a silver platter as a reward for her dancing for her stepfather's amusement. The experimental play was highly controversial, and rehearsals even had to be cancelled after the play was banned by the Lord Chamberlain, who censored Wilde's work to its depiction of religious characters, since at the time, all plays presented in Britain had to be approved by the Lord Chamberlain. Vernon Lee, whose real name was Violet Paget, began writing her own decadent Gothic stories, characterized by historicism, in the 1870s. For example, the protagonist of Vernon Lee's Amour dur, Spiridon Trepka, a young Polish historian, is commissioned to write a history of Urbania in Italy. There he reads about a young woman, Medea de Carpi, who died in the early 17th century, who was known for her many lovers, many of whom eventually died for her or because of her. Spiridon becomes obsessed and is eventually haunted by the witchy Medea. At the turn of the century, decadent writers who started abandoning the style began writing to align with more novel movements such as symbolism and surrealism. By the First World War, the decadent movement as it existed had disappeared. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and want to see more.